This episode contains discussions of injury and death of animals and humans. If these topics are triggers for you, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. The turn of the 19th century was an era of exploration, specifically polar exploration. Hundreds of European explorers set their sights on the Arctic and the Antarctic. We discussed one of these explorers already, Sir John Franklin, who attempted to find the Northwest Passage, an Arctic route to the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, he and his crew froze to death after suffering starvation, cannibalism, and a long, cold, desperate march across King William Island. Many countries raced to plant their flags at the poles. The British had been attempting to conquer the Arctic, also called the North Pole, since 1553. Numerous attempts were made by many European countries throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. In 1903, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen finally traversed the Northwest Passage. On April 6, 1909, American Robert Peary claimed to be the first person in recorded history to reach the North Pole, although whether he actually reached the pole is disputed. It seemed the Arctic had been conquered. The focus quickly shifted to the Antarctic, also called the South Pole. The first documented sighting of the Antarctic continent occurred in January of 1820. In 1823, James Weddell, a British sealer, sailed into what is now known as the Weddell Sea. Weddell found very favorable ice conditions, which allowed him to set a record for the furthest south. In the late 1830s, French, American, and British attempts were made to land on the continent after the approximate location of the southern magnetic pole was determined by James Clark Ross. The first documented landing on mainland Antarctica was that of American sealer Mercator Cooper, which occurred in early 1853. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration began at the end of the 19th century and lasted until 1914 with the start of World War I. During this period, the Antarctic continent became the focus of an international effort that resulted in intensive scientific and geographical exploration. 17 major Antarctic expeditions were launched from 10 different countries. The first attempt was the Dundee Antarctic Expedition of 1892 and 1893. The expedition included several naturalists and an artist. Upon their return, the publications, both scientific and popular, and exhibitions reignited public interest in the Antarctic. A lecture given by Dr. John Murray entitled The Renewal of Antarctic Exploration, given to the Royal Geographical Society in London, piqued the interest of the British scientific community. The Discovery Expedition, officially known as the British Antarctic Expedition, launched in 1901 and was led by Robert Falcon Scott. The expedition set up a base camp in McMurdo Sound, an area that still houses Antarctic research facilities, such as McMurdo Station. Scott and his crew scaled the western mountains in Victoria Land and discovered the polar plateau. They also set a new furthest south record and discovered, mapped, and named many geographical features. Robert Falcon Scott was born on the 6th of June, 1868. His early childhood was comfortable, and at 13 he became a naval cadet. In July of 1883, at the age of 18, Scott was noticed by Clements Markham, the secretary of the Royal Geographical Society, who was always on the lookout for young naval officers he deemed fit for polar exploration. He was impressed by Scott's intelligence, enthusiasm, and charm. Scott's career progressed smoothly, with a promotion to lieutenant in 1889. In 1894, however, Scott's father went bankrupt, and in 1897 he died. Then Scott's brother Archie died in 1898 of typhoid, making Scott financially responsible for his family. He sought a promotion to bring in more money, but promotions were hard to get in the Royal Navy. In June of 1899, Scott ran into Markham again, who told him of a planned expedition to the Antarctic. Scott asked to lead the British Antarctic expedition, nicknamed the Discovery Expedition after its lead ship. After some debate with the Royal Society, who wanted a scientist in command, Scott was named leader and promoted to the rank of commander. Discovery sailed for the Antarctic on the 6th of August, 1901. Organized under a joint committee of the Royal Society and Royal Geographical Society, or RGS, the goals of the expedition were scientific research and geographical exploration in what was then largely an untouched continent. With Scott went Ernest Shackleton, another British explorer. The venture was nearly a disaster. Scurvy plagued the expedition, as did cold, hunger, and isolation. They eventually made it to 850 kilometers from the South Pole before having to turn back. Shackleton had to be sent home due to scurvy, frostbite, and a breakdown. Still, they explored and mapped the area and made many biological, zoological, and geological discoveries. It took 2 relief ships to pry the Discovery from the ice. It was a tense journey back to England, as Scott insisted on Royal Navy formalities on the 2 relief ships. When they returned, Scott was welcomed as a hero by the public. He was also promoted to captain and then knighted. Scott's account of the expedition, The Voyage of the Discovery, was published in 1905. However, Scott's inclusion of Shackleton's breakdown during the journey led to tension between the 2 men. Scott seemed to imply that the breakdown had caused the expedition to turn back before reaching the South Pole. Unfortunately for Shackleton, the book was extremely popular. Scott intended to try again for the South Pole and was working with the Royal Geographic Society to do so, but before their venture was made public, Shackleton announced his own plans to lead an expedition to both the geographic and magnetic South Poles. The magnetic South Pole is the point on the Earth's southern hemisphere where the geomagnetic field lines are directed perpendicular to the nominal surface. It's constantly shifting due to changes over time in Earth's magnetic field. The geographic South Pole, or terrestrial South Pole, also known just as the South Pole, is the most southern point of the Earth's axis of rotation. Scott and Shackleton made a deal that McMurdo Sound was Scott's to explore. However, unable to find a safe place to land anywhere else, Shackleton was forced to break that promise. His expedition, called the Nimrod Expedition, failed to reach the South Pole, but was highly successful otherwise. They made it less than 100 miles from the South Pole and did reach the magnetic South Pole. Scott felt betrayed by his ex-colleague and dismissed him as a liar and a rogue. Shackleton's failure to reach the terrestrial South Pole jump-started a race. In 1910, 2 expeditions set out to reach the South Pole. One was a Norwegian party led by polar explorer Roald Amundsen on the ship Fram, meaning forward. And the other was the second British Antarctic expedition led by Scott on the ship Terra Nova, meaning new land, which had previously acted as a relief ship for the Discovery expedition. This ship was reinforced from bow to stern with 7 feet of oak to protect against the Antarctic ice pack. This was Amundsen's first foray into the Antarctic, but he had plentiful experience of the Arctic. With a crew of 19 experienced and eclectic men, Amundsen had planned an Arctic journey, but changed course toward the South Pole. Scott planned a large-scale scientific and geographical expedition. He wanted to make sure the scientific work was exceptional, so appointed Edward Wilson as his chief scientist. Wilson had been part of the Discovery expedition and was a naturalist and trained physician. He was also Scott's closest friend. Wilson selected an experienced team for the expedition, 65 men, including 7 who'd been on the Discovery expedition and 5 who'd gone with Shackleton on his Nimrod expedition. The expedition set off from Cardiff in June of 1910. At the same time, Roald Amundsen's Norwegian expedition was making their way south. The race was on. Before we get into the cold details of Scott's second and final expedition, an ad must play. If these ads annoy you, you can access ad-free episodes by joining the MCP Patreon community for as little as $2 a month at bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron. You can also gift a membership to the MCP Patreon community. In January of 1911, Scott and his crew landed on Ross Island, an island of volcanic rock on the edge of Antarctica. They set up camp very close to the location where Scott had camped during the first British Antarctic expedition. This area is known as Cape Evans. At this location, Scott hoped the ice would melt in the summers, allowing for resupply of rations and crew via the Terra Nova. Their first task was to set up a base camp. Scott's base camp, called the Hut, was prefabricated in England and brought south by ship. It was a 50 by 25 foot or 15 by 7.6 meters wide rectangle, insulated by a layer of quilted seaweed between an inner and outer wall. The roof was a similar sandwich of layers of plank, rubber, and quilted seaweed. The hut, which Scott christened Camp Evans after his second-in-command, was heated via the kitchen stove as well as a coal-burning stove. It was well insulated and efficiently heated, with most Terra Nova expeditioners describing it as uncomfortably warm inside. Lighting was provided by acetylene gas lamps, also called carbide lamps. These lamps are fairly safe, but as acetylene is an unstable flammable gas, there was potential for explosions if mishandled. Also, the gas smelled of garlic, so the hut likely also smelled of garlic. The Terra Nova shore party, which was a team of 25 men plus Scott, lived in this hut all winter. Lieutenant Edward Evans was second in command after Scott. He'd given up his own South Pole expedition plans to join Scott. Royal Navy Lieutenant Harry Pennell was the navigator and would take command of the Terra Nova once the shore party landed. There were 2 Royal Navy surgeon lieutenants, George Murray Levick and Edward L. Atkinson. Victor Campbell, an ex-Royal Navy officer known as the Wicked Mate, was one of the few members who knew how to ski. Harry Robertson Bowers, also known as Birdie, was a lieutenant in the Royal Indian Marines. Lawrence Oates, also known as Titus, was an army captain from the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons, who had donated funds and his services to the expedition. Trygve Gran was a young Norwegian ski expert who would train everyone to ski. The Antarctic veterans were Navyman Edgar Evans, no relation to Edward Evans, Tom Crean, and William Lashley. 2 other seamen, Patrick Keohane and Robert Ford, were also part of the shore party. Thomas Clissold was the cook. Frederick Hooper was a domestic steward. Russian Dmitry Gerov was in charge of the sled dogs, along with Cecil Mears, a British explorer. Anton Omelchenko, a Ukrainian groom, looked after the ponies with Lawrence Oates. Bernard Day, a motor specialist, oversaw the motor sledges. I'll talk more about ponies, dogs, and sledges in a moment. As for the scientific team, Edward Wilson was the chief scientist. He was a qualified medical doctor, a distinguished research zoologist, and a talented illustrator. His personally chosen team included meteorologist George Simpson, Canadian physicist Charles Wright, senior geologist T. Griffith Taylor, geologists Frank Debenham and Raymond Priestley, biologist Edward W. Nelson and Dennis G. Lilly, and assistant zoologist Apsley Cherry Gerard. Herbert Ponting was the expedition's photographer. His photographs left a vivid visual record of the expedition, both the hardships and the camaraderie. Diaries of the shore party reveal that the 25 men were quite cozy in the hut. The building was divided into separate areas for sleeping and working by a wall of supply chests. A building for the 19 Siberian ponies was attached to the north wall. A small porch came off the southwest end of the building, which was later converted into a utility room. The main goal of the expedition was to reach the South Pole, but there were many steps in this process and many opportunities to perform scientific observations and explore the area, side quests, if you will, all of which required the team to move about and move their supplies and equipment through the frozen wasteland. Scott brought 3 forms of transport: sled dogs, ponies, and motor sledges. The motors and animals were to help haul supplies across the barrier, now known as the Ross Ice Shelf. This ice shelf is a thick plate of ice several hundred meters thick and around the size of France, floating in the Southern Ocean. Its sides are nearly vertical and rise about 50 to 160 feet, or 15 to 50 meters, above the water's surface. The Ross Ice Shelf was the starting area for most early Antarctic explorers. Shackleton had been the first to cross it during his expedition. Supplies had to be hauled across the ice shelf in order to set up supply depots, locations where the explorers could resupply and rest on their journey. These depots had to be placed and supplied all from base camp, so there was a lot of trekking back and forth from the hut to the depots. The supplies then had to be moved from depot to depot, further and further south, so the explorers were never too far from their supplies. That was the idea, anyway. Once the hut was established, Scott and the shore party began placing supply depots. The work was carried out by 12 men, 8 ponies, and 2 dog teams. It was very difficult as the soft snow slowed down travel, and there were several heavy blizzards. 2 ponies froze to death. On February 4th, the party established Corner Camp, 40 miles or 64 kilometers from Camp Evans. They were marooned there for 3 days by a blizzard. The final depot was the largest and was called 1 Ton Depot. Due to weather conditions and the deaths of the ponies, the depot was laid 30 miles short of its intended position. This had disastrous consequences, as you'll soon hear. On the way back from 1 Ton Depot, one of the dog sled teams fell into a crevasse when the wooden bridge they had built over it broke under their weight. 1 dog was killed, but no men. As the surviving ponies were crossing the sea ice near Hut Point, the ice broke up and 3 more ponies died. Of the 8 ponies that had been brought on the journey, only 2 returned. While the depots were being set up, a small exploration party led by Victor Campbell went scouting east along the coast in the Terra Nova. On their return westward along the Ross Ice Shelf, they encountered Roald Amundson's expedition, camped in the Bay of Whales, an inlet in the barrier about 2,500 kilometers east of Scott's camp. Amundsen was courteous and hospitable with Campbell. When Campbell returned to Cape Evans and reported this development, Scott was annoyed, but decided to proceed exactly as planned. A geological exploration of the coast west of McMurdo Sound also took place before the first winter set in. A small party containing geologist Griffith Taylor, Debenham, Wright, and Edgar Evans took the Terra Nova across the Ross Archipelago to Butter Point, just opposite Cape Evans on the shore. They established a depot and then explored and surveyed the Dry Valley, a valley that was free of snow, and the Taylor Glacier, known for its reddish-pink icefall called Blood Falls. They returned to Hut Point just as winter was descending. Over the winter, which in the southern hemisphere is March to October, the group holed up in Camp Evans. In the Antarctic winter, the sun doesn't rise above the horizon due to the angle of the Earth's axis, so the entire winter was spent in darkness. The temperatures also plummeted to around -40 to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -40 to -45 degrees Celsius. Despite this, all was well in the hut. The men did scientific and station work, exercised the ponies and dogs, played football, and gave lectures on various subjects. On the 6th of June, a feast was held for Scott's 43rd birthday. Another feast occurred on the 21st of June for Midwinter Day, the midpoint of the long polar night. Part of the expedition spent the winter elsewhere. After reporting Amundsen's location, Campbell's party became the Northern Party and sailed northward to Camp Adair with a plan to explore and map the area in the summer. The Northern Party was made up of Campbell, Priestley, Levick, George P. Abbott, Harry Dickerson, and Frank V. Browning. They built their own hut at Robertson Bay and spent the winter there. Chief Scientist Edward Wilson was keen to follow up earlier research on emperor penguins, as a rookery existed near Cape Crozier, about 60 miles or 97 kilometers away. He wanted to acquire emperor penguin eggs at an early stage of development, which meant collecting them in the dead of winter. He also felt it would be a good opportunity to experiment with food rations and equipment that would be used during the attempt at the South Pole. Scott approved, and a party consisting of Wilson, Bowers, and Cherry Gerard set out on the 27th of June, 1911. Traveling during the Antarctic winter had not been previously tried, and for good reason. Gear, clothes, and sleeping bags were constantly coated in ice. At one point, the temperature fell below -77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -61 degrees Celsius. After reaching Cape Crozier, the group built an igloo from snow blocks and stone with a canvas sheet for a roof. They were able to visit the penguin colony and collect several eggs, but their shelter was almost destroyed in a blizzard. The party made it back to Camp Evans on the 1st of August with 3 eggs, which ended up in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. The eggs failed to support Wilson's theories on penguin development, and Cherry Gerard described the mission as, quote, "the worst journey in the world," end quote. Once the sun rose above the horizon and summer arrived, so did the polar day. The sun shone 24 hours a day as the expedition continued their work. The Geological Research Party, led by Taylor, now called the Western Party, continued their previous research, this time concentrating on Granite Harbor, about 50 miles or 80 kilometers north of Butter Point. The Western Party was made up of Taylor, Debenham, Gran, and Ford. They left Camp Evans on November 14th, traveling over sea ice and arriving at Granite Harbor on the 26th. They set up a base camp at Geology Point, where they built a stone hut called Granite House, which they used for cooking and heat. Over the next few weeks, they explored and surveyed the area, mapping, naming, and collecting geological specimens. The Terra Nova was scheduled to pick them up on the 15th of January 1912, but heavy sea ice prevented the meeting. Faced with the possibility of being trapped for the winter, the party left Granite Harbor on foot and traveled overland back toward the winter quarters on Ross Island. About a month later, the party was spotted and picked up by the ship and returned safely to Camp Evans. The Northern Party, still headed by Campbell, was taken to Evans Cove on January 4th, a location approximately 250 miles or 400 kilometers south of Cape Adair and 200 miles or 320 kilometers northwest of Cape Evans. After completing their geological research, they waited for the Terra Nova to return. However, due to heavy pack ice, the ship was unable to reach them. The group dug a snow cave on Inexpressible Island and were forced to spend the winter there. They had meager rations, but were able to fish and hunt seals. The winter was tough. They suffered frostbite, dysentery, and hunger, extreme winds, and low temperatures. Somehow, the Northern Party managed to survive. Despite their physical weakness, the whole party made it back to Camp Evans on the 7th of November. The main quest began on October 24, 1911. Scott set out to conquer the South Pole with 15 men. The plan was to take the 2 remaining motor sledges, the ponies and dogs, across the Ross Ice Shelf. They would then send the dogs back to base and shoot the ponies for food. Then, 12 men would split into 3 groups and ascend the Beardmore Glacier, then trek across the Antarctic Plateau, a large elevated area of East Antarctica that includes the South Pole. The average elevation of the plateau is about 3,000 meters or 9,800 feet. The elevation, high winds, and extremely long sunless winters means the temperatures on the plateau are the lowest in the world, falling as low as -92 degrees Celsius. That's -134 degrees Fahrenheit. After planting their flag at the South Pole, they planned to return to the hut along the route of established depots. 2 groups would be sent back at specific points in the journey, and the last one would carry on to the South Pole. For the return journey, Scott ordered the dog teams to assist them by replenishing depots and meeting the polar party between latitude 82 and 82.3 on the 1st of March. The motor sledges went first, but had to be abandoned after only a few miles, as they froze up and broke down. Scott and the dog teams caught up with the motors on foot, killing 1 pony at a time to feed the sled dogs. They were hit by a blizzard, which forced them to camp for a few days and break into the rations they'd brought for the return journey. By December 10th, they reached the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. The climb was grueling due to soft, deep snow causing everyone to sink. They only progressed 5 miles a day, working for 10 to 12 hours. Thankfully, conditions improved the higher they went. As planned, Mears and the dog teams returned to base on December 11th. On the 20th, the parties reached the polar plateau and erected a depot. The going was much easier, and they were able to make up lost time. On December 22nd, Atkinson, Cherry Gerard, Wright, and Keohane turned back as planned. The final support team, made up of Lieutenant Evans, Lashley, and Crean, turned back on the 3rd of January 1912, about 150 miles from the South Pole. Scott, Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Edgar Evans continued on. They had a month's provisions and were excellently equipped. They passed Shackleton's furthest south record. When they were about 15 miles or 25 kilometers from the South Pole, they spotted a black flag in the distance. It was Amundsen's flag. He'd beat them to it by 33 days. To add insult to injury, upon discovering Amundsen's camp, Scott found a letter to King Haakon VII of Norway, which had a note politely asking Scott to deliver the letter. Meanwhile, on the return journey, Lieutenant Evans was fighting scurvy. It got so bad he couldn't walk or stand. He had to be dragged to within 30 miles of base camp. At that point, Crean ran ahead and got Dr. Atkinson to help pull him home. Evans eventually stabilized and was sent back to New Zealand. The return journey went quickly for Scott and his team. However, by the time they reached the Beardmore Glacier, Edgar Evans was frostbitten and injured. Oates's feet were badly frostbitten. Wilson had collected 30 pounds or 14 kilograms of fossils, adding to the weight of their sledges. Near the bottom of the glacier, Evans collapsed. He died on the 17th of February. This was the beginning of the end for Scott and his team. The dog teams didn't meet them when expected. There was a large drop in temperature. There wasn't enough fuel in the depots. By March 10th, the party accepted that the dog teams were not coming. Oates, whose hands and feet were nearly useless, voluntarily left the tent and walked to his death. Scott wrote that Oates's last words were, quote, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time," end quote. They struggled on, Scott's right toes becoming frostbitten. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers were then hit by a fierce blizzard. For days, they were unable to go any further. The remaining expedition members at Cape Evans waited and waited. A party set out in October to look for Scott. On the 12th of November, the search party spotted a tent 11 miles or 18 kilometers south of One Ton Depot. Inside the tent lay the frozen bodies of Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. Atkinson found Scott's diary, which revealed the group's last moments. The last entry was on the 29th of March, 1912. The search party collected diaries, personal effects, and records. Then the tent was collapsed over the bodies. A cairn of snow was built over it, topped with a cross fashioned out of skis. Oates's body was never found. The Terra Nova arrived at Cape Evans for the last time on January 18, 1913. Before leaving, the crew erected a large wooden cross on a hill overlooking Hut Point, inscribed with the 5 names of the dead, and a quotation from Tennyson's Ulysses, quote, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield," end quote. What did Scott achieve? What was gained from his expedition? Many geological observations were recorded, maps were made, fossils were found, and new creatures in the form of protozoa were discovered. Wilson's fossils, the ones that weighed down their sledges on the way back, came to prove the theory of continental drift. At the time, though, these discoveries seemed to pale in comparison to being the first to reach the South Pole. Scott became a tragic hero for his efforts. As time went on, Captain Scott was criticized for indecisiveness, poor planning, and hubris. One major point of the critics is that Scott didn't plan for his return journey. However, Scott did leave written orders in October of 1911 for the Polar Party's relief by the dog teams. These orders were not carried out by the men at the base. Modern re-examinations of the events suggest strongly that misjudgments and possible miscommunications at Cape Evans resulted in their failure to rescue Scott and his Polar Party. Much scholarship has been dedicated to the question, could Scott have been saved? The most likely answer is yes. However, he and his team were not rescued. Such are the risks of polar exploration, or any exploration for that matter. It's a risk taken by many, and the tragedies are felt by many more. But the adventure, the exploration, the unknown is what draws out our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.